When classifying cows, we look at 4 different areas. The first of these areas is the rump, and the rump contributes 10% to the overall score. When looking at the rump, we look at 4 different traits. We look at rump angle, pin width, loin strength, and furl placement. And I'm going to demonstrate how each of these traits is measured. The first of these is rump angle, where we are looking at the slope between the hip and the pin. So when we're measuring this, and we're doing this visually, we are actually imagining a line from the top of the hip, and we've got that level. So we are trying to measure what distance there is between the bottom of that rod and the top of the pin. And that measurement is recorded. For each trait, we have an ideal. For rump, the ideal is a score of 5 to 6, because every trait has a linear score 1 to 9. For rump angle, 5 and 6 is ideal. If we go lower, we get to 7s, 8s and 9s. If we go higher, we're going to go 4, 3, 2s and 1s. The further we are away from the ideal, the greater will be the penalty when the score for rump is calculated for that rump angle trait. For varying measurements, there will be the corresponding linear for each individual animal. This rump angle contributes 24% to the total rump score. The next trait that we assess is pin width. And when we're looking at pin width, we are looking at the width between the most posterior points of the pins. For this, we can actually do a direct measurement. Because this is a measured trait, I can get the measurement. I can add this to the handheld, and once again, it will come up with a corresponding linear which relates to this particular individual animal. The weighting for the pin width on rump score is 21%. The third trait that we look at when looking at rump is loin strength. The loin is that part of the animal which runs in this region here, from behind the last rib to the level of the hip. For this loin, we like the loin to be as broad as possible. We also like the loin to be as high as possible. Here I have the 6 bones which make up the loin of a particular cow. You can see that these bones have large processes which stick out the side, and that's what we're seeing here when we're looking at the short ribs. You can also see there is quite a height between these short ribs and the top line, and that is reflected by the height of these processes on the vertebrae running down the animal's midline. Having seen the bone structure, it makes it much easier to appreciate what we're looking at here with the height, which we refer to as the bridge, and the width. We like there to be as much height and as much width as possible, because the more bone process we have, the more surface area of bone we have for muscles, tendons and ligaments to actually attach, and those structures keep this loin intact. When we look at the way the bones are actually arranged in the animal, we can see here we have the loin. In front of that, we've got the chest, the neck, the head, the legs. We've got a lot of weight. Behind the loin, we have the pelvis, we have the bones of the hind leg, and the bones of the tail. In this region of the barrel, we've got that filled with a large rumen full of food, water. There is a lot of weight dragging on that loin. Invariably, you find that cows which are aged and still very active, very productive, are those animals which have always had a strong loin. If that loin weakens, it will tend to dip. That affects the animal's comfort, it affects her walking ability, and it affects her profitability. Because this loin is so important for the animal's workability, we will find later on that loin strength also contributes 6% of the total of her dairy strength score, which we will consider later. When assessing the linear for the loin strength, it is something which is subjective. It is not measurable as rump angle and pin width were. So it is up to the classifier to assess the width, the bridging. We also like to make sure that we see the animal moving when this loin strength is assessed, because quite often an animal when standing looks quite strong there. But as soon as she moves, especially if there is a weakening of that loin, a concavity will appear, showing a weakness. And so the animal, both standing and walking, must be assessed to get the best linear evaluation for that loin strength character. The loin strength 9 is ideal. So we want that loin to be as strong as possible. As it becomes weaker, we go down score for a very weak loin, we will get a linear 1. An animal with a very strong loin will have a straight top line, both when standing and when walking. And we can even allow for a slight degree of convexity there, because that's an indication of strength which is required in that region. The final trait which we look at for rump is furl placement. The furl is that region between the hip and the pin, and if we look at the skeleton, if we look at the pelvis, we can see how we have the hip, we have the pin, and in this area we have the socket of the hip joint. And it's the outside of that hip joint which is the furl location. Now, when measuring furl placement, we actually take a line from behind the hip and just in front of the pin. And we look at where the furl is in relation to the pin and the hip. The ideal ratio is 60% from hip to furl, 40% from furl to pin. 6 is ideal. 6 is the 60-40 ratio. As we move further forwards, we get to 55-45, and that is a 7. As we move further forwards, we get to 50-50, which is the 9. And that's not a problem. And there is very little penalty for being away from the ideal. Because the furl is the region of the hip joint, as the furl moves backwards, which is most common, the significance of the furl placement becomes important. We know that's where the hip joint starts, so if the hind leg is set onto the pelvic bone further back, it's going to affect the set of the leg, most likely. As we move backwards, we go 65-35, that would be a 5. As we go to 70-30, that would be a 4. So as we go back further, the linear will be less, and because there is more effect on the animal as the furl is backwards, there is going to be a greater penalty. 60-40 is ideal. Furl placement has a 24% weighting for rump score. When assessing rumps, there are a few defects which are regarded as undesirable. Those defects include advanced anus, advanced tail head, recessed tail head, high tail head, and right tail. Each of those defects can be slight or pronounced. If they are pronounced, the penalty for that defect is doubled.